Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you today from Montreal, Canada. Last night, the world witnessed a fairly remarkable spectacle, and that spectacle was the first debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump for the upcoming US presidential election. Biden and Trump spent much of their time arguing about which of them was the worst president in US history. My own view, for what it's worth, is that they are pretty much tied for that honor. But whatever you may think about that question, certainly arguing about who is the worst president ever is hardly a constructive way to engage with voters on the issues confronting Americans. Of course, Trump lied a great deal last night, although not always, and we'll come back to that, whereas Biden lied a fair bit himself. But what really made the headlines was Biden's inability to speak and think like a normal, functioning human being. Immediately following the debate, prominent Democrats and major liberal media organizations, including The Guardian and The New York Times, issued a stream of panic statements and articles calling on the Democrats to think seriously about replacing Joe Biden at the upcoming Democratic Party convention. Now, here to discuss all of this with me is an American who will participate as a candidate herself in the upcoming US elections, and her name is Diane Sare. Diane has declared her candidacy for the 2024 race for the United States Senator from New York. She successfully achieved ballot status for the 2022 US Senate race against Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer by submitting 66,000 signatures, well over the 45,000 signatures required. No other statewide minority party or candidate was able to meet that very onerous threshold. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, Diane. It's a pleasure to finally have an opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks very much. And it looks like I'm on the ballot again, and this time closer to 70,000 signatures. And I may again be the only statewide independent candidate. It depends on if Robert Kennedy Jr. is able to win a whole series of legal challenges to his petition signatures.
Well, before we talk about the debate, and by the way, congratulations. That is, as someone who's run for political office, I can say that that is quite an impressive achievement. So it's no small matter to get almost 70,000 signatures. Good on you. But before we talk about the debate, I'd like to talk about your motivation for running. And it's my understanding that you are passionately opposed to U.S. government's forever wars and its hegemonic foreign policy. In fact, your positions on those issues was the main reason that you first came to my attention, because these are things that matter a great deal to me as well. But I also understand that you're committed to the reindustrialization of the United States and the world, with the goal being to uplift the quality of living of all through scientific and technological progress. So with that as background, Diane, please, what is it that motivated you to run and to do this again, to put you through yourself through the rigors of another senatorial electoral contest?
Well, in a sense, it's a good question, because it's especially the petitioning this time was really horrific. Having a presidential election year made it much more difficult. Population is very polarized. People are brainwashed about Republican, Democrat. I'm running as an independent, and they said, oh, well, that'll take votes from I mean, it was very tough. And people are much more unhappy, very unhappy. So why I'm running, you know, I grew up in a New England Quaker family. I guess activism is somehow in my blood. I've always felt like I should be doing something about the fate of mankind, the condition of mankind. And when I was a student at New England Conservatory, I ran into Lyndon LaRouche, who was then on trial, then running for president, and heard him speak at a conference addressed by many leaders from nations in Africa, South America, and it struck me that the starvation, which I had been so worried about, and the poverty was not an accident. Now, that may seem naive, but I thought, oh, well, they just had a terrible drought, or maybe it was a war. It never occurred to me that someone could be so evil as to deliberately impose misery on entire nations. And I remember when this got through to me, I had a migraine headache for 3 days. It was terrible. And then I said, you know, I'm an American. I have, just by being a citizen, not anyone, I have more power than an infant starving to death in Sudan or somewhere else. And it just, I felt that I had a moral obligation as an American citizen to do something about it. So many years later, in 2012, I ran for Congress the first time in New Jersey as a Democrat, but calling for the impeachment of Barack Obama. So my campaign was a bit controversial, to say the least. And I moved to New York about four or so years ago, ran against Schumer in 2022. And exactly for this reason, the intelligence agencies, the lies into war, not feeling that I could quite carry off a campaign for the presidency. I said, let's take US Senate in New York. That's pretty powerful. It's a way of providing leadership and direction for the nation overall, and it's a platform to give voice to ideas that need to be heard. So that's why I did it, and I'm doing it.
And, you know, uh, I myself, Diane, I don't know whether you're aware of this. You may not be. I, for many years, have identified as a leftist, and I would even go as far as to say a socialist, and ran as such for the Green Party of Canada leadership in 2020. And I've become increasingly, shall we say, unconvinced by the left-right labels, although I continue to consider myself a leftist. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is I saw and have seen, right up until the current time, many people who have identified as leftists for a long time, supporting even enthusiastically censorship, which I am strongly opposed to in all its forms. And also I saw a lot of people who were self-described leftists jumping onto this bandwagon for arming Ukraine and bringing NATO right up to the precipice of nuclear war with Russia, which is where I believe we are today. And so I've become troubled by these labels and begun to wonder how much they really mean anymore. I'm curious what you think about these labels. Would you, you mentioned Lyndon LaRouche. A lot of people on the left would regard Lyndon LaRouche, and they may not understand who he was. They may have many misconceptions, as being very right-wing. Some probably would say he was even extremely right-wing. What do you make of this left-right distinction, and whatever meaning you may attach to it? Do you think it's possible for the left and the right to find common ground today?
I agree with you that it's becoming increasingly meaningless. I think a more productive discussion is on the question of natural law and the question of universal principles, which is what natural law reflects, and the relationship of mankind to the universe. And what I mean by that is, look, the American Revolution, let's take that, against the British Empire. In our Declaration of Independence, we asserted that says all men, they mean everyone is created equal. We still haven't attained that, but it's true. Every single person on the planet is born with an equal potential. How does the government defend that? And if that's true, it means you don't have kings, you don't have people who get to rule because of their bloodline or because of how much money they have, but because of the consent of the governed, that in a human system, the human beings can decide of their own volition to allow another person whom they place their trust in to make certain critical decisions, right, for the nation, for the well-being of all. So the government is supposed to uphold this principle, and our economy is supposed to be reflective of that. That credit, as Hamilton understood, is supposed to be directed for those things that increase life expectancy, increase productivity, allow people to be better. I think future generations, I don't think we should be so egotistical as to say, I want to be the greatest genius of all time, and no one after me should ever surpass my brilliance. And I mean, that's a really disgusting view. It seems to be sort of the view of the United States after the Berlin Wall came down. We're the global hegemon. That's a really sick view, and it doesn't bode well for the perpetuation of the human species. So I think that we have to get to a place where what people are actually discussing is, what is the relation? Do we want our species to be an immortal species? And if we think that we should be, which I do, how do we attain that? What is our relationship to nature? What is our relationship to other human beings? Is there a value in a nation state, for example? I think there is, but it means that you recognize that there's a shared mission, and perhaps the fact that someone speaks a different language, has a different religious background, may mean that you can triangulate on solving some of the thorny problems facing mankind, because someone coming at it from a slightly different perspective may gain an insight that you wouldn't have. So I think this has to be the way that humanity moves forward. Now, how do you put that in a bottle or call it left or right or party or doesn't fit?
Right. Now, I'd like to switch to the subject of last night's debate, which in many ways raised, if only obliquely, a number of the important issues you just mentioned. As a general matter, I'm going to show you a couple of clips from the debate and ask you for your specific commentary on it. But did you have an opportunity to watch the debate? And if so, what was your overall impression of it as a candidate?
I really didn't want to watch it, and I got a phone call from a news media outlet that told me they wanted my comments on the debate after. So I said, "Oh, all right, I'm going to have to watch this thing." So I did watch it, and my comments, so you know, is I said, well, the big loser in the debate was the American people. I said that it's clear that Biden is mentally infirm. He should not be serving as president now, let alone running for another 4 terms. That if you want to say of the two who won, Trump won, but he still is bragging about the assassination of Soleimani, which was an international crime. So, and neither one of them has any understanding of physical economy from the standpoint I just elaborated, which may be the biggest threat if we don't have a nuclear war, which is probably the #1 threat. So I think it was really pretty terrible. And there were a few points that came out clearly, which I think we're going to discuss on the Ukraine-Russia situation, the
Yes.
danger of nuclear war, but, very, I would say, underwhelming. And you would think with 330 million Americans, we could do better than this. And I also think it was outrageous that,
You can, by the way.
yeah, I hope so. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was excluded. Not that I think he's so great either, but he's a name, he's getting on the ballot, he's overcoming a bunch of these crazy hurdles for ballot access, obviously a serious contender with a lot of support, and I think his voice deserved to be in there. And the whole process, the fact that the debate was held before the conventions, which I know people are saying was probably done so the Democratic Party could dump Biden. Well, great, but where do the American people come in? Are we allowed to vote in a primary? Are we allowed to? Apparently not. The Democratic Party is going to dictate who the candidate will be, and it doesn't matter what you think. So those were all thoughts I had about this.
So I will show you, first of all, about a 1-minute clip in a moment, but I must say that I have my issues with RFK, particularly on the question of Palestine, but not just that question. And nonetheless, the fact that a Kennedy was excluded from the debate really, I think, drives home the extent to which these two parties control American politics. I mean, if a Kennedy can't get into a debate, especially with these two clowns, what hope is there really for someone who is neither a Democrat nor Republican to access the White House? But let's move on to this particular excerpt. I'd like to get your reaction to this.
He had the largest national debt of any president in a 4-year period, #1. #2, that $2 trillion tax cut benefited the very wealthy. what I'm going to do is fix the tax system. For example, we have 1,000 trillionaires in America. I mean, billionaires in America. And what's happening? They're in a situation where they, in fact, pay 8.2% in taxes. If they just paid 24%, 25%, either one of those numbers, they'd raise $500 billion, I should say, in a 10-year period. We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare because all of these people are coming in. They're putting them on Medicare. They're putting them on Social Security. They're going to destroy Social Security.
The reason why I chose this clip, Diane, and it's either, I don't know, tragic comedy, I don't know what to call it. I could have chosen so many others, is the President of the United States concluded a rambling, largely incoherent answer in which he repeatedly corrected himself with the phrase, "We beat Medicare." Now, I don't know about you, but I think this was entirely foreseeable, this performance. We have all been watching aghast for months, really going all the way back to the 2020 election, that the reality that Joe Biden is in an intellectually diminished state, and more so by the day. Why Democrats find this performance surprising really is astonishing to me. I can't make any sense of it, but there's a real question, I think, that arises from all of this, and this is what I want to ask you. Given what we saw last night, and I think it's now clear, I mean, even Democrats, as I said at the outset, are openly acknowledging that this man is not fit to be the president. Who, in fact, has been running the country for the last 3+ years? It doesn't seem to have been Joe Biden. What are your thoughts about all that? I mean, I know you don't have access to the White House, but I'm curious, as a senatorial candidate and someone who lives in the United States and who's a keen observer of politics, who do you think's driving the bus?
I don't know. I could speculate, but my own view is that ever since the assassination of President Kennedy, the fact that the Warren Commission was allowed to do this unbelievable cover-up means, in effect, that whoever it was that assassinated him has been running the country ever since. I think that's in large part why we're not allowed to have a qualified presidential candidate, because anyone qualified will just be, I mean, Trump and Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Jr., are far from perfect. They're not qualified, in my opinion, to be president, but they each have enough deviations from the narrative that wants to be rammed through by this treasonous cabal in our intelligence agencies and State Department, that both of them are under spectacularly blistering attack, whether they're being silenced altogether as Kennedy is, or 91 indictments as Trump is. And it's unfortunate, by the way, I'll say, because it confuses people. I mean, people say, well, they're really afraid of Trump. He must be a genius, right? Or Kennedy must be he's so qualified. That's why they want him out of the. No, it just means that the system is so desperate right now that they can't afford a leader who even deviates by a millimeter from the narrative that they're ramming down our throats.
Right. The next clip I'd like to show you relates to a subject you've already mentioned, one that I know you and I both care about deeply, and that's this proxy war in Ukraine. So I'm going to play a bit of commentary from Mr. Trump, former President Trump, about that war.
Russia, they took a lot of land from Bush. They took a lot of land from Obama and Biden. They took no land, nothing from Trump, nothing. He knew not to do it. He's not going to play games with me. He knew that. I got along with him very well, but he knew not to play games. He took nothing from me. But now he's going to take the whole thing from this man right here. That's a war that should have never started. It would have never started ever with me. And he's going to take Ukraine. And, you know, you asked me a question before, would you do this? He's got us in such a bad position right now with Ukraine and Russia. because Ukraine's not winning that war. He said, I will never settle until such time. They're running out of people. They're running out of soldiers. They've lost so many people. It's so sad. They've lost so many people, and they've lost those gorgeous cities with the golden domes that are 1,000 years old, all because of him and stupid decisions. Russia would have never attacked if I were president.
Trump, the question.
Now, Diane, this is one of, predictably when the debate was over, liberal media talking heads tried their best to focus upon the fact that Trump lied. And there's no question that he said a lot of things which were false, which were even outrageously false, but he also spoke the truth sometimes. And it seems to me that what he said about the Ukraine war just now, I'm not talking about the part where he said that Russia would have attacked or would not have attacked if he were the president. I'm talking about the state of the battlefield. It seems to me that that is a very, very honest assessment of the situation. What do you make of what's happening in the Ukraine war? What do you think we should be doing about that war? And if Donald Trump were to regain the presidency, do you actually believe that he's the man for that job, for fixing that mess? And you mentioned, I just want to, before I turn it over to you, point out that you mentioned the case of Soleimani, the most senior general in the Iranian military, whom the Trump administration assassinated with no lawful justification. I believe it was 2020, and almost ignited a catastrophic war throughout the Middle East. So I think we have good reason to question whether Donald Trump is a peacemaker. What do you have to say about all of this?
I don't know. I actually do think that had Trump been president, this whole war would not have happened. I would hope it would have been because Trump would have listened when Putin was screaming diplomatically back in December of 2021 about the legitimate security concerns of Russia. And I know, if you remember, what Trump was impeached for was actually threatening to cut off weapons to Ukraine. He made a phone call. So that I also find of interest. And he said even in the debate that he and Putin got along very well. So, with Trump, it's very difficult to read because he's an actor. And therefore, you don't know if it's all bluff and bluster, what he means, what he would really say behind the scenes. So I'm not sure. But I do think we would have a much greater chance of coming to some sane conclusion that Trump wants that. And it may be as banal a reason as war is simply bad for business. He thinks like a businessman, not a statesman.
Right. That's absolutely clear. So if you had the presidency or whoever the next president may be, what would you tell him to do about this absolutely horrific and destructive war?
Well, the first step is to recognize Ukraine is not winning. The longer it goes on, the more Ukraine will lose and the more territory they're going to lose. And that's the nature of war. And other people can say whatever they want. In a war that is not ended, there is a victor and a vanquished. And at a certain point, Ukraine will have no say whatsoever or we'll all be dead if we try and stop it. I'm not sure. So I think Putin's speech to the foreign ministry of June 14th is really important because he outlined not only a peace proposal or a starting point in effect for negotiations, but he also put it in the context that the world has changed. The United States is no longer the global hegemon. There's an entirely new principle among the BRICS nations. And when you look at, for example, what's happening at the UN around Gaza, it's about 85% of the world is saying we don't have to go with this Anglo-American narrative anymore. So that's really the context. So the president of the United States, in my view, is obligated to act in the context of the global strategic situation. The United States has a critical role to play. If we would face the reality that Ukraine has lost the war, and let's see how we can end this thing to alleviate as much suffering as possible and come up with something that allows the legitimate security concerns of both Russia and what's left of Ukraine to be addressed, we should do that. And I think we should look, Putin keeps referencing the near agreements that were negotiated in Turkey between Ukraine and Russia, which included, to my surprise, denazification of Ukraine, which I think is very important. So I think all of these elements would have to be included.
You're referring, I take it, to the negotiations that took place in the first few months after the invasion began.
About 6 weeks after. I mean, isn't that amazing? This could have all been over.
Absolutely, with much less territorial loss. And reportedly, Boris Johnson, apparently at the behest of the Biden administration, went to Kiev and read Zelensky the Riot Act, as a result of which the deal collapsed. And there seems to be strong evidence of that. Let's talk about another war. Obviously, this genocidal, I mean, I don't know what your assessment is when it comes to the question of genocide. It's certainly mine as a lawyer and as someone who was actually in Palestine in March, that this is a genocide. It meets the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention. We know that the Biden administration is providing huge amounts of munitions to Israel, and that those munitions are being used to obliterate the civilian population of Gaza. Again, if you had the president's ear, what would your advice be in terms of dealing with this absolute horror show that we're witnessing in the occupied territories?
Well, first of all, I read the 84-page submission from South Africa to the International Court of Justice, and I concur it is a genocide. It's not a question. I think everyone in the world knows that the President of the United States has the leverage to tell Netanyahu to cut it out, and this would stop. The idea of building this stupid temporary bridge or landing port or whatever it is, which got washed away in the first serious storm, is just a fraud, because there's not a million, but there's multiple gateways from Israel into Gaza, which could be demanded to be opened to stop people from dying of starvation and lack of medical care and everything else. And we're not doing that. So it's a fraud. The US could put a halt to this immediately. I think that the Oasis plan, again, of Lyndon LaRouche from way back in 1975, which his widow, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, has put on the table, is really important. Many people say, oh, you have to have a political agreement first. I do think a Palestinian state must be recognized, because they need to be able to negotiate on equal terms as a state. But beyond that, what is the benefit of peace? And that's where I think the idea of greening the desert, not just rebuilding. No one should live in a refugee camp ever again. There should be beautiful, new, modern cities in Palestine with electricity, with running water, with Palestinians, maybe because they're bombed so much. I don't really know the history of why there are so many phenomenal engineers of Palestinian origin, but it seems to me they have a workforce and skill set that could meet this challenge. So I think there has to be a peace plan. Imagine World War II if we decided that Germany was not going to be rebuilt, or if MacArthur had been an idiot in Japan, and we said it's good that they're leveled, let them starve, and then they'll really suffer and they'll never do it again, which is today, I'm sorry to say, way too much the American psyche. And you see it in our prison systems as well, right? Well, the way people learn is you bludgeon them and torture them, and then they decide they're never going to do it again. Well, actually, no, that's the way you get a revolt. That's the way you get people to rebel, because it goes against human nature. So the US, again, could be a force for peace, but we are not. And there's an enormous amount of foreign money, I would say British, Israeli, Zionist, and multinational corporations being thrown around during the election season to try and silence people.
Like Jamal Bowman, who wasn't actually much of a critic of Israel, when you look
Right.
at his commentary, but he wasn't totally enthralled to the Zionist project, and that was enough to seal his fate. Now, I'd like to switch to finally another subject, which is, I mean, on the one hand, I, as a Canadian, looking with great interest in what is happening on your side of the border, I find this preoccupation with immigration in the U.S. political discourse to be bizarre. But at the same time, I have to confess that I'm not particularly up to speed with what is happening on the southern border. And there do appear to be serious issues about, people entering illegally from Mexico into the United States and how that's all being dealt with and so forth. This is a difficult issue for the left because on the one hand, people of my ideological orientation want very much to help immigrants, refugees. I don't believe that anybody should have to live in poverty. I don't think your nationality entitles you to a superior quality of life, your ethnicity, your religion. We're all entitled to the means to fulfill our potential as human beings. And so on the one hand, I'm very, very averse to the idea of throwing those people into the sea or just casting them back into the desert south of the border. On the other hand, there are people in the United States who are economically deprived, who are just scraping by in low-wage jobs. They are disproportionately people from racialized groups, Blacks and Hispanics and Indigenous people. And my understanding is that they feel threatened, some of them, by the influx of people from poor countries because they feel that their jobs are at risk. And without those jobs, they simply wouldn't be able to survive. They're living from paycheck to paycheck. So this is a thorny issue for the left. It's one that came up repeatedly last night. I'm not going to repeat anything that Donald Trump said because whatever your views may be about how to deal with this problem, the rhetoric he employs, I find so deeply offensive. So he's demonizing anybody, it seems, who, no matter how desperate they may be, enters the United States illegally. What do you think is the solution to this? I mean, how big is the problem, first of all? Is the problem as big as people like Donald Trump claim it to be on the southern border and just generally with illegal immigration? And secondly, whatever the magnitude of the problem may be, how would you deal with this problem?
Well, it is a big problem. It's a big problem because of something that neither candidate would admit, which is the United States is already in collapse. So prior to the influx of migrants, take New York City, we already had a situation where 100,000 students in the New York City public schools were homeless. 1 out of 10, which is unbelievable and outrageous. And certain boroughs were dealing with classes where 50%, like the Bronx and Brooklyn, 50% of the students were homeless. And the teachers found themselves handing out toothpaste and deodorant and helping people doing their laundry and trying to combat body odor. And how do you teach? So then you bring another, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people have come in this way with no planning, no means to deal with them, and you create a disaster. I mean, it is a humanitarian disaster. I was reading yesterday that homelessness in New York City now is at an all-time high. They're estimating 350,000 homeless people in New York City.
That's
And
unbelievable.
yeah, and it is very dangerous. I have to tell you, petitioning, you have to be really on your toes because another factor, which is nationwide in the United States since the year 1960 will take, the United States eliminated 90% of our inpatient psychiatric beds. So you had a massive 90%. Okay, so we dumped. In the case of New York, we had 93,000 inpatient psychiatric beds in 1958. Now we have under 9,000.
Wow. And the population of New York is what, approaching
19 million. Yeah, approaching 20 million.
Wow.
So you have an enormous number of mentally ill people on the streets. Then you had the pandemic where they took everyone out of the shelters, which were not ideal by any means. I'm not going to defend the wonderfulness of the shelter system, but they had social workers, drug counselors, they had a network to help these people, and they dispersed them all into the hotels. Trump says the 5-star hotels. Yeah, with 4 people in a room or 6 people in a room or whatever. And then they paid the hotels the full asking price, not what you pay when you use your AAA discount or your senior citizen and you pay half or a third of what's on the door for what the room is supposed to spend. So this was a scam. They used the homeless population as a conduit to bail out the hotel industry. And this is the game on the migrants in part. I think there's many ways this cuts. One, we have no business overthrowing governments in other parts of the world, imposing deadly sanctions on Venezuela, where they say the #1 exporter of migrants to New York is Venezuela. That's not who I met, by the way, when I went to the Roosevelt Hotel. I met a whole bunch of people from West Africa. And that's another story, because that's then not because we overthrew their government particularly, although we're keeping people impoverished, but it's because of cartels. Somebody with an airplane, probably drug cartels, human trafficking cartels. I spoke enough French, my little pidgin high school French, to talk to this young man from Mauritania. I said, how did you come to be here? He said, well, they came and they told us Biden has opened the border. Give us $5,000 and you can get on a plane to fly into Nicaragua and then get on, and that's how he got here. So this young man probably was one of the most enterprising people in his family. He would be a valuable worker in Mauritania if they were allowed to develop. He's here sleeping on the sidewalk in New York City. And so the combination of the mental illness, I was talking the other day, I've been organizing in Manhattan. I'd like to tell you about that, because that may be one of the largest Jewish populations outside of Israel. And I want to tell you about the response there, which gives me some hope. But
please do, by the way. Absolutely.
yeah, I will. So you have all these people now. What kind of work are they doing? They're doing deliveries on electric bikes with batteries that are catching fire. They also don't know the traffic rules. So driving in New York is a nightmare, because you're either going to kill one of these people who has no idea about when to signal, where to drive, how to, or they are going to run over someone. It is a mess. It is a serious problem. It has to be addressed. And I think there's different aspects of it. One is my aspect, which is shut down Wall Street in the city of London. We got to put them through bankruptcy. We got to find out where all this money laundering is, and we got to shut down these cartels. That will at least stem some of the flow where people are being lured onto planes over in Africa somewhere or whatever. We got to stop overthrowing governments. We have to reform the whole system. We need to allow people to enter the US legally at much greater rates. People who try to come in legally are waiting 10 and 20 years. That's outrageous. So we need a whole system at the border. If I had my druthers, I think we should get the Army Corps of Engineers to build facilities on the border, hospitals, schools, etc. Get people in. They should have a crash course in English for a number of weeks, citizenship, civics courses, training, see what kind of skills people have. If we were going to build the infrastructure we need, there would be a welcome workforce. These people want to work really hard. So train them, don't make them compete and undercut American wages, right? There's a way to do this, which is rational and treats people with human dignity, including our own people. But it is a very serious problem. I don't think it's exaggerated in that sense. It's having a devastating effect on people in the cities that have been flooded with people when they already were not caring for the people that they had to begin with.
I just want to, before I turn it over to you on this question of the event you talked about with the Jewish community in New York City, on a personal note, my parents came to Canada in the 1950s as teenagers. They didn't have a day of high school education, and they left the country because of the grinding poverty, partly due to the brutal Nazi occupation, but also following the Second World War, the British government fomented a civil war in Greece in order to prevent the communists, who had put up the most resistance to the Nazis, from coming to power. And so the brutal Nazi occupation was followed by a devastating civil war, and my parents were effectively forced to come to Canada just to be able to pursue a decent life. It was very clear to me as a young man that they didn't want to come. They didn't want to leave their country. They were deeply in love with the country of Greece, the culture, the society. They came because of economic privation. And my personal view as a child of immigrants is that if we stopped impeding the development of countries in the global South, this problem would be much more manageable, because people would, I think the natural inclination of people is to stay within their own societies and cultures and not to go far afield where they're aliens and they have to start all over again in life. But that's just my own personal observation.
That's far too reasonable. Well, if they had crash economic infrastructure programs that needed millions of people to work in them to the south of the United States, probably Americans would start flooding across the border to go get the jobs down there.
That day may come. We'll see.
Right.
So finally, please do tell us about this experience you had with members of the New York Jewish community. I know that the war in Palestine, I think I'm being generous by calling it a war, has obviously created a lot of tension and emotion in New York City, where there is a large Jewish community, and many of whose members, I think, and increasingly so, are vigorously opposed to the policies of the Netanyahu government.
Right. And of course, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan is Columbia University, where they had the, campouts, etc., tent cities protesting the genocide. By the way, the charges have all been dropped against the 30 students who were charged and arrested there, finally, appropriately dropped. But it was extremely controversial, and the police state tactics against the students were really amazing. I went there just to see what was going on, and the whole campus was locked down. I mean, no one could get in or out without a proper ID. And what was really disgusting, I thought, is by the main entrance gate on 116th Street, across the street, you had this gaggle of every major news media just waiting for someone to be arrested or whatever so they could cover it. So this created a kind of tension in the neighborhood. In my first run against Schumer, we had a very hard time getting signatures in Manhattan. People just tend not to stop. It was a difficult place petitioning. But a friend of mine and I, one of my volunteers who also happens to be Jewish, said, well, why don't we, let's try Manhattan. I wanted to go there and see what's happening. So we went to start petitioning in Manhattan, and we couldn't go right near Columbia because it was just so tense and the press was there. But when we got a few blocks away, what I began picking up was how anguished the Jewish residents of New York were about this conflict, about seeing the students treated so badly, about hearing the barbaric crimes of the IDF, about the hostages. They have pictures plastered on all the telephone poles of all the hostages, and people were in a real turmoil, which is a good place to be because then they're open. You can begin to talk to them and organize them. So we did have some fanatics who threatened violence against us. I wore my ceasefire button as we were petitioning. But we also had people who said, yeah, I'm really with the students. I really want to help. And I got this idea because New Yorkers are so powerful in many of these Jewish organizations that we could get a breakout for the Oasis Plan. We could get a breakout for peace by organizing in Manhattan. So I've been trying to have a very serious presence of my campaign there. And one of the conversations I just want to relate because I think it gives an example of how important it is to bring the dialogue to the streets. We have a table which says, on the one hand, ceasefire, build bridges, bridges not bombs. And then we have another one that says no war with Russia. So we can deflect all the people who think we should arm Ukraine. and you find the best people. So one woman comes up to the table. She's Palestinian Christian from the West Bank. She's got her 5 or 6-year-old son with her. She said, I am so upset about this genocide. These people are being killed in Gaza. They look just like my son. She could, just very upset, start signing up. Then another woman comes over, Jewish, pro-Zionist. We have to kill them all. They're not surrendering, just in a complete rage. Turns out she's from Gaza and Jewish, and then the two of them go at it, loggerheads, in this brawl that goes on for about 15 minutes. And then I hear the Jewish woman saying, well, I know about the checkpoints. You're right. They're really terrible. They shouldn't be like that. Yeah, I know about that. Yeah, that's awful what the settlers are doing. The dialogue continues. The two women end up exchanging phone numbers and then turn around and say, we're so glad you had this table here because we never would have had this conversation.
Wow. Wow. Well, that is a sign of optimism in a world in which optimism is greatly needed. Thank you for sharing that with us, Diane. And so it's been a pleasure talking to you. And just so people know where to find your website and what your campaign's all about, please, where can that be found?
My website is Sare for Senate, and that's SAREFOR Senate.com. I am on Facebook, TikTok, X, Instagram. I am being massively shadow banned, so you have to look and spell everything right to find me. But that's where you can find me.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we can have a discussion like this in the future.
Thank you very much.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada.